The day of the competition was bright, but inside the large concert hall the air felt heavy with nerves and expectations. Young musicians dressed in polished suits and elegant dresses stood around in small groups talking about famous composers and rehearsing their pieces one last time. Some laughed loudly, others whispered softly, but everyone seemed sure of themselves. Everyone except one quiet girl who stood near the back, holding a small bag and looking around as if she didn't belong there. She was simple in appearance, wearing a plain dress and worn shoes that had clearly seen better days. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, and her eyes kept wandering toward the grand piano on stage, a beautiful black instrument shining under the lights. That piano wasn't just a piece of wood and strings to her. It was something magical, something that had been part of her life for as long as she could remember. The quiet girl had come alone. There was no teacher beside her, no parent cheering from the corner, no friend helping her calm down. She had traveled early that morning from a small town several hours away, taking a long bus ride just to be here. For her, this wasn't about winning fame or a prize. It was about finally showing the world something she had kept hidden all her life, her love for music. As the organizers called out the contestants' names, she listened carefully. Some of them sounded familiar, young pianists who had already made a name for themselves. They had been trained by well-known instructors, some had played abroad, and others had parents who were musicians themselves. When they walked up to the stage, the crowd applauded politely, expecting great things. But when her turn approached, she could feel people's eyes on her. Curious, uncertain, maybe even a little judgmental. A few of the contestants glanced at her and whispered quietly, thinking she couldn't hear. "She looks like she's never played in a real competition before," one of them said softly. Another laughed and added, "Maybe she's just here to watch." She didn't react. She simply lowered her gaze and took a deep breath. She had heard things like that before. Ever since she was a child, she had been quiet. Not because she was shy, but because words never seemed enough. The piano had always spoken for her better than she could ever speak for herself. She remembered her first piano, an old upright one that her mother had found at a second-hand store. The keys were chipped, some notes didn't play, but it was enough to light a fire in her heart. Every evening after school, while others went out to play, she sat by that piano and taught herself melodies by ear. There were no lessons, no sheet music at first, only her curiosity and endless hours of trying again and again until the sound felt right. Her mother used to sit nearby, quietly listening. She would smile whenever her daughter played something new. "You have music inside you," her mother once said softly. Never let the world silence it. That memory still warmed her heart, especially now. It had been years since her mother passed away, and sometimes the only way she could still feel close to her was through the piano. Every time she played, it felt like her mother was right there beside her, smiling again. When her number was finally called, she stood up slowly, her heart thumping so hard she could feel it in her chest. She walked toward the stage with careful steps. The lights above were bright, almost blinding, and for a moment she felt small, smaller than she had ever felt before. The stage looked huge, and the audience stretched out endlessly in front of her. Judges sat at a long table, their faces calm and unreadable. One of them adjusted his glasses and glanced down at her registration form. Another leaned slightly back, as if already preparing to be unimpressed. She could feel every eye following her as she approached the piano. Her hands trembled a little when she reached for the bench. She took a moment to adjust its height, making sure it was comfortable, then placed her small hands on her lap and closed her eyes for just a second. In that small moment of silence, she remembered all the nights she had practiced in her room, sometimes until midnight when everyone else in the house was asleep. She remembered the sound of rain hitting the window while her fingers danced across the keys, and how the world outside disappeared whenever she played. Now, standing before hundreds of people, she knew this was her chance. She didn't have fancy clothes or a famous teacher to introduce her. She didn't have the confidence that others carried so easily. But she had something stronger, the music she had lived with, breathed with, and loved more than anything else. A faint murmur rose from the audience as she placed her hands on the keys. Someone in the back whispered something, and a few quiet laughs followed. She ignored it completely. The only thing she could hear now was the soft hum of the piano beneath her fingers. Then, she pressed the first key. The sound was soft, almost too soft, but it carried across the room like a whisper that demanded to be heard. A few people leaned forward. The notes that followed were gentle but full of emotion, each one flowing into the next as naturally as breathing. The piece she chose to play wasn't one from the list of required classical pieces that most others had picked. It was something she had written herself, a melody that came to her one evening when she missed her mother the most. It was simple, but every note carried a piece of her heart. She played it slowly at first, feeling every sound as it filled the hall. Then the music began to rise, her fingers moving faster, stronger, like waves rolling over each other. Her whole body seemed to move with it, not dramatically, but gently, as if the music itself was guiding her. For the first time, the judges' faces changed. One of them leaned forward, eyes narrowing in surprise. Another looked down at her notes, trying to figure out what piece this was. They couldn't find it because it was her own creation. In the audience, people stopped whispering. The hall became completely silent except for the piano. Each note seemed to float in the air, wrapping around everyone like a story being told without words. The quiet girl who had entered the hall unnoticed was now the center of attention. Not because she was loud, not because she tried to impress anyone, but because her music was speaking in a way no one else has had. As she played the last few bars, her hands began to slow. The melody softened again like a gentle goodbye. When the final note faded, it felt like time itself had stopped. For a few seconds there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just stillness. Then the first clap came from the back of the hall. Another followed, and another. Within moments, the entire room was filled with applause. Some people even stood up. She blinked, almost unsure of what was happening. Her hands were still hovering above the keys. Slowly, she turned to face the audience. The judges were clapping too, not politely, but genuinely. A warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't pride exactly. It was something deeper, the quiet happiness of finally being heard. For years, she had played alone, wondering if her music meant anything. Now, standing on that stage, she knew it did. When she left the stage, people watched her differently. There were no more whispers of doubt or laughter. The other contestants who had once smirked at her now looked at her with respect, even admiration. She didn't smile widely or wave. She simply nodded politely, clutching her small bag once again, and walked quietly off to the side. Inside, though, her heart felt light. She found an empty corner of the hall and sat down, closing her eyes. The sound of applause still echoed in her ears. She could almost hear her mother's voice again, soft and proud, saying, "See? I told you, you have music inside you." For the rest of that afternoon, her name stayed on everyone's lips. People asked the organizers who she was, what school she came from, who had trained her. But there was no impressive answer. Only a simple story of a girl who loved the piano more than anything else in the world. And though the competition wasn't over yet, everyone already knew they had witnessed something special, not just a performance, but a piece of someone's soul. After leaving the stage, the quiet girl sat at the back of the hall, her heart still racing. The sound of applause was gone now, replaced by the echo of the next contestant's performance. She folded her hands on her lap and stared down at them, trying to calm herself. They still trembled slightly, not from fear anymore, but from something new, something that felt like hope. For the first time in her life, she had been seen. Not as a quiet girl from a small town, not as someone who didn't belong, but as a musician. The memory of the applause still played in her head, louder than any note she had ever touched. It felt unreal, almost like a dream she didn't want to wake up from. As she sat there, one of the assistants from the event walked over to her. He smiled kindly and said, "The judges were really impressed. They want you to stay until the end. They might want to speak with you." She nodded quietly, not trusting her voice to come out steady. She thanked him softly and watched as he walked away. Around her, the other contestants were preparing for their turns, fixing their hair, adjusting their sheet music, whispering about her performance. She could feel their glances. Some of them looked surprised, others thoughtful, and a few looked uncomfortable, as if they regretted underestimating her earlier. One girl, who had laughed before her performance, now approached her with a hesitant smile. "Hey," she said, "that was really beautiful. I didn't expect that." The quiet girl looked up and returned a small smile. "Thank you," she said simply. There was no pride or arrogance in her tone, only honesty. She wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong. She had only wanted to play. As more contestants took their turns, the atmosphere in the hall shifted. Before her performance, there had been a loud, competitive energy. Everyone had been eager to show off speed and skill. But now, after hearing her, many of them played differently, softer, slower, trying to add emotion rather than just precision. It was as if her music had reminded everyone that a piano was not about who could play the fastest, but who could make people feel something. When the final performance ended, the judges left the room to decide the results. The contestants were asked to wait. The quiet girl sat alone near the corner, looking around at the hall that had once made her feel so small. Now it seemed different, warmer somehow. She thought of her mother again. She imagined how proud she would have been to see this moment. Every lesson her mother had taught her, about patience, humility, and honesty, had led her here. She remembered those long nights when her mother would hum a melody while she practiced, and how they both laughed when she hit the wrong keys. Those were the moments that shaped her. When the judges finally returned, the room fell silent. The head judge stood with a clipboard, smiling slightly as he looked at the young faces before him. He began to speak about how proud he was of everyone, how much talent had been shown that day. His voice echoed softly through the hall. Then he said something that made her heart stop. "Before we announce the winners," he said, "we want to give special recognition to one performance that deeply moved all of us, not for its difficulty, but for its heart." Every eye turned toward her. She felt her face grow warm. The judge continued, "The quiet girl who came on stage today reminded us of what music truly means. She played from her soul. That is what this art is about." A few people clapped softly, and she looked down, her hands tightening on her skirt. She didn't know what to do or say. She had never been praised publicly like that before. The judges then announced the top 3 winners. Her name wasn't in that list, and surprisingly, she didn't feel disappointed. Winning suddenly didn't seem important. She had already received something more valuable: respect. The judges had seen her, and that was enough. After the ceremony ended, people began leaving. Some contestants came up to her to shake her hand, asking about her piece, where she had learned to play. When she told them she had no teacher, only her old piano and her mother's encouragement, they looked at her with disbelief. "You taught yourself?" one of them asked. She nodded softly. "I just listened a lot," she said. "I tried until it sounded right." As the crowd thinned out, one of the judges, an older man with kind eyes, approached her personally. He had been the one who looked surprised during her performance. He smiled warmly and said, "You have a rare gift. Do you write all your own pieces?" She hesitated before answering. "Most of them," she said. "I don't have many written down, though. I usually just play what I feel." "That's beautiful," the judge said gently. "Music like that doesn't come from training. It comes from life. Keep doing what you're doing. Don't lose that honesty." He handed her a small card. "This is my contact. If you ever want to study more formally, call me. I would be honored to guide you." She accepted the card with trembling hands. She couldn't believe it. A respected judge offering to mentor her. It felt unreal. After everyone left, she stayed in the hall for a while, sitting quietly near the piano again. The lights had dimmed and the staff were cleaning up. She ran her fingers lightly over the keys, not to play, just to feel them once more. Each one carried the memory of her moment on stage. When she finally stepped outside, the evening air was cool. The sun had already set, painting the sky with shades of purple and gold. She walked toward the bus stop with slow steps, still holding the judge's card tightly in her hand. As she waited for the bus, she thought about how strange the day had been. She had walked into the hall feeling invisible, and now she was leaving with people's respect and an opportunity she had never imagined. Her eyes filled with tears, but they weren't sad ones. They were tears of relief, of gratitude. When she got home late that night, she quietly opened the door to her small house. It was silent except for the ticking of a clock on the wall. The old piano stood in the corner of the living room, the same one she had learned on years ago. She walked to it and gently touched its keys, whispering, "We did it." She sat down and began to play softly. It wasn't the same piece from the competition. It was something new, something calm and full of peace. She smiled to herself as the notes filled the little room. The sound wasn't perfect, but it was real. As the days passed, the competition became the talk of her small town. People who had never paid attention to her before now looked at her with admiration. Some asked her to play at small gatherings, schools, and local events. Each time she played, she felt more confident, more connected to her music. A few weeks later, she received a letter in the mail. It was from the same judge who had given her his card. He wrote that a local foundation was offering her a scholarship to attend a music conservatory in the city. They wanted to nurture her talent to help her grow. She held the letter close to her chest, tears filling her eyes again. It was a dream she never dared to dream. She thought of her mother again, of how proud she would have been. "You did it, Mama," she whispered softly. "You helped me get here." The night before she left for the city, she went to the piano one last time. The moonlight streamed through the window, falling across the keys. She played her mother's favorite song, the same lullaby that had started it all. When the last note faded, she sat quietly for a long time. She wasn't the same shy girl who had once doubted herself. She had found her voice not through words, but through music. As she looked around the room, she realized something important. No matter where she went or how many stages she played on, this little piano would always be her beginning. It had carried her through loneliness, through doubt, and finally into a world that was ready to listen. That night, she promised herself that she would never change, that she would always play from the heart, just like her mother taught her. Because in the end, that was what made her music different. It wasn't about perfection. It was about truth. And the truth was, she had finally learned to believe in herself. The morning she left her small town for the city felt like a dream. The bus station was quiet, the air still cool from the night. She stood by her suitcase, holding a small bag with her music sheets tucked inside. The letter of acceptance from the conservatory was folded neatly in her pocket, already worn from how many times she had read it. When the bus arrived, she looked back one last time. The road behind her led to everything she had known: her home, her neighbors, her late mother's garden, and the old piano that had given her hope. A gentle wind brushed her hair as if saying goodbye. She took a deep breath, wiped her eyes, and stepped onto the bus. The journey to the city took hours. She watched out the window as green fields turned into busy streets, the quiet countryside slowly giving way to tall buildings and endless noise. The city felt alive, almost too alive. People rushing, horns honking, lights flashing everywhere. It was nothing like the calm simplicity she was used to. When she reached the conservatory, she stood in front of the grand building for a long time, staring in awe. The wide marble steps, tall doors, and echoes of distant instruments made her heart race. She could hear faint notes of violins and pianos drifting through the halls even from outside. It felt like walking into another world. Inside, students hurried past her, carrying folders of music and talking excitedly about upcoming performances. She felt small again, just like the first day of the competition. Everyone looked confident and polished, and she, with her simple clothes and quiet nature, looked out of place. A kind receptionist handed her a welcome packet and showed her to the dormitory. Her new room was small but neat, with a single bed, a desk, and a window overlooking the courtyard. On the first night, she lay awake listening to the faint music from other rooms. Each note reminded her of why she was here. She whispered to herself, "This is your chance. Don't be afraid." The next morning, she attended her first class. The room was large, filled with shiny grand pianos. The instructor was a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a serious voice. He asked each student to play something so he could understand their skill level. When it was her turn, she hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. She played a short melody, one she had written herself, soft and gentle. When she finished, the instructor looked thoughtful. "You play differently," he said. "Your technique is untrained, but your feeling is rare," the class murmured quietly. Some students smiled politely, others whispered among themselves. But she didn't care. She wasn't there to impress them. She was there to learn. Days turned into weeks. Life at the conservatory wasn't easy. The lessons were demanding, and the city moved faster than she could keep up with. There were days she felt completely lost. Days when her classmates talked about theory and technique she had never even heard of. She stayed up late most nights, practicing until her fingers ached. But even when she felt discouraged, she never gave up. Whenever she doubted herself, she remembered her mother's words, "You have music inside you." That thought carried her through every challenge. One evening, after a long day of classes, she stayed behind in the practice room long after everyone else had gone. The lights were dim, the hallways quiet. She sat at the piano, closed her eyes, and began to play. It was a piece she hadn't shared with anyone, something new she had been writing since she arrived. It told the story of her journey, leaving home, finding courage, and holding on to her dream. The notes filled the empty room, gentle but full of life. As she played, she didn't realize someone was standing at the door listening. It was her instructor. He watched silently, moved by the honesty in her music. When she finished, he walked in slowly and said, "You have a gift that can't be taught. Never lose that. You must perform this piece at the upcoming recital." Her eyes widened. The recital was a big event, attended by students, teachers, and even visiting musicians from around the world. The idea of playing in front of so many people terrified her. But her teacher's expression was firm yet kind. "This is your moment," he said gently. "You don't need to be the loudest or the fastest. Just be yourself." For the next few weeks, she prepared for the recital. Every morning she practiced before classes began, and every night she stayed late to polish her piece. Some of her classmates began to notice her dedication. A few who had once ignored her started to greet her with smiles. One girl even offered to help her with reading sheet music properly. Slowly, she began to feel that she belonged. The conservatory didn't feel as frightening anymore. The teachers started recognizing her by name, and even the janitor who cleaned the practice rooms often paused to listen to her play. "You play from the heart," he once said. "Don't ever stop doing that." The day of the recital arrived faster than she expected. The main concert hall was filled with people, students in formal clothes, parents, teachers, and guests. The grand piano sat in the center of the stage under soft golden lights. She stood backstage, her hands trembling, her breath short. She could hear the muffled sound of applause for the performer before her. The music was flawless, quick, technical, confident. She closed her eyes and tried to remind herself why she was here. She wasn't here to compete. She was here to speak through her music, the only language that had ever felt natural to her. When her name was called, she walked onto the stage. The light hit her face, bright and warm. She bowed politely to the audience and sat down. For a brief moment, she looked out at the sea of faces. She could feel her heart pounding, but she also felt something else: peace. She placed her hands on the keys and began to play. The first notes were soft, just like at the competition months ago. But this time the music was deeper, fuller. It carried the story of everything she had been through: her mother's love, the long bus ride, the loneliness, and the strength she had found within herself. The audience grew still. Even the restless students who had been whispering earlier now listened quietly. Her music seemed to wrap around everyone, filling the hall with warmth. She didn't play for applause. She played for the little girl who once sat at an old piano in a tiny house, dreaming of this very moment. When she finished, there was a long silence, the kind of silence that holds meaning. Then, just like before, the applause began softly and grew louder until the whole room was standing. People were clapping, cheering, even shouting her name. Her teacher was smiling proudly from the side of the stage, his eyes glistening. She stood, bowed again, and tried to smile, though tears had already filled her eyes. She felt light, almost weightless, as if the music had lifted her. After the recital, many people came to her wanting to talk. A well-known pianist approached her and said, "Your playing reminded me of why I fell in love with music. It's been years since I've felt that." Reporters took her picture and students congratulated her, but in the middle of all the noise and excitement, she stayed humble. She thanked everyone softly, always with that gentle smile that came from the heart. Later that night, after the hall had emptied and the lights were dim, she returned to the stage. The piano was still there, gleaming quietly in the dark. She sat down once more and played a few soft notes just for herself. No audience, no judges, no expectations, just her and the piano like it had always been. She thought about her journey again, how far she had come, and how much further she could go. But instead of feeling pressure, she felt gratitude. Every challenge, every lonely night, every doubt had shaped her. As the final note faded into silence, she smiled to herself and whispered, "Thank you. Mama, I'm still playing for you." She stood up, turned off the small stage light, and walked out into the cool night air. The stars above the city were faint compared to those in her small town, but she still looked up and felt the same comfort. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more challenges, more critics, more moments of fear. But now she had something unshakable, belief, not just in her music, but in herself. And as she walked back to her dorm that night, the sound of the piano lingered in her heart, soft and steady, like a promise that her story was only just beginning. Weeks passed after the recital, but the memory of that night still lived fresh in her heart. Sometimes when she walked through the halls of the conservatory, people would nod at her, whispering softly, "That's the girl who moved the audience to tears." It still felt strange to her. She had never been someone who liked attention, yet now people looked at her with admiration and respect. Her teacher often reminded her, "You have something rare. Don't lose it trying to be like everyone else." She took those words seriously. While many students tried to master difficult pieces to impress others, she kept focusing on creating music that felt honest. She spent long evenings at the piano, playing quietly until the sound of each note matched the emotion she wanted to share. Still, life wasn't suddenly perfect. The more attention she got, the more pressure came with it. Some people began expecting her to be extraordinary all the time. If she made even a small mistake in class, she could feel their disappointment. It made her nervous. There were days when her hands trembled so much that she could barely play. One afternoon during practice, she stopped halfway through a piece. The sound coming from the piano didn't feel right. It wasn't just about missing a note. It felt like something inside her was fading. She sighed and rested her hands on her lap, staring blankly at the keys. Her teacher, who had been passing by, noticed her struggle. He walked into the room quietly and sat beside her. "You're thinking too much," he said softly. "Music isn't about fear. It's about feeling. Don't let people's expectations silence your heart." She nodded, but the worry still lingered. After he left, she sat for a while, staring at the empty room. She realized that the more recognition she gained, the more afraid she became of losing it. For the first time, she missed home. The peace of her small town, the old piano, the sound of rain outside her window. Back then, she played only for herself and her mother's memory. Now it felt like she was playing for the whole world, and the weight of it made her hands heavy. That night, she couldn't sleep. She walked quietly to the conservatory's main hall, which was empty and dark. The only light came from the moon shining through the tall glass windows. She sat down at one of the pianos and began to play slowly. It wasn't a song she had planned. It just came naturally, soft and pure. As the music filled the empty space, she felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. Peace. The sound wasn't perfect, but it was real. She closed her eyes, letting the melody flow like a conversation with her soul. What she didn't know was that a young man, one of her classmates, had been passing by and stopped to listen. He stood quietly near the doorway, not wanting to disturb her. When she finished, he spoke softly. "That was beautiful," he said. Startled, she turned to see him standing there. He smiled kindly and added, "I didn't mean to interrupt. I just couldn't walk away. You play like you're telling a story." She blushed slightly and looked down. "I was just thinking," she said. "Sometimes when I can't sleep, I play." He nodded. "I understand. Music helps me think too. You know, your playing reminds me that music doesn't need to be perfect to be powerful." They talked for a while, sharing stories about their lives. He told her about how his family expected him to be a performer since childhood, how he felt trapped by those expectations. She told him about her small town, her mother, and how she learned to play on her own. There was something comforting in their conversation. Two people who loved music for what it truly was, not what others wanted it to be. After that night, they often practiced in the same room. They didn't talk much while playing, but there was a quiet understanding between them. Sometimes he would listen to her compositions and offer small suggestions. Other times he'd ask her to listen to his and give honest feedback. For the first time since coming to the city, she didn't feel so alone. One afternoon, as they sat together, he asked, "Have you ever thought about performing outside the conservatory? There are public concerts around the city. It could be a good experience." She hesitated. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," she said. "It feels different playing for strangers." He smiled. "Maybe that's exactly why you should. Sometimes the world needs to hear music from people who play with heart." His words stayed with her. A few days later, she found herself standing in a busy city square, where an old public piano sat near a fountain. People passed by, some stopping briefly, others too busy to notice. Her hands shook as she lifted the piano cover. She wasn't sure what she was doing, but she knew she had to try. When she began to play, the noise around her started to fade. Her melody rose above the city sounds, soft, calming, honest. One by one, people slowed down and turned to listen. Some stopped, holding their bags or coffee cups, their faces softening as they listened. Children sat on the ground, wide-eyed. A man recording on his phone smiled and whispered, "She's incredible." She didn't know it, but that short performance would spread quickly. Someone posted the video online with the caption, "A quiet girl playing like the world's forgotten what music feels like." Within days, the video gained thousands of views. Messages flooded in from people saying her music made them cry, made them remember their own dreams, made them feel peace after a long time. When she read those comments later, tears filled her eyes. She had never thought her simple playing could touch people she had never met. She realized then that music had a life of its own. It could travel far beyond what she could see. Back at the conservatory, her teacher showed her the video on his phone with a proud smile. "You've done something rare," he said. "You've reminded people that art isn't about fame or perfection. It's about connection." The following weeks were a whirlwind. Invitations started coming from small events, local galleries, and even television shows. But she didn't rush to accept them all. She chose carefully, always asking herself one question before saying yes. Will this keep my music honest? She continued performing in small places, hospitals, schools, community centers, places where people didn't expect a concert, but needed one. Each time, she played with the same sincerity as if it were her first performance. Her friendship with the young man grew stronger, too. He often accompanied her, sometimes helping set up, sometimes just standing quietly in the back, watching her with a proud smile. They didn't need many words between them. The music always said enough. But with growing attention came new challenges. A few music producers began approaching her, offering recording deals. They promised fame, travel, luxury, but in return they wanted to change her style. "Make it faster," one said. "Add more energy. That's what sells." Another added, "People love spectacle, not simplicity." She listened politely but refused every offer that didn't feel right. "My music isn't for selling," she said calmly. "It's for feeling." Some called her foolish for turning down such big opportunities, but she didn't regret it. She remembered how lost she had felt when she tried to play for others' approval. She never wanted to lose her voice again. One evening, after performing at a small charity event, she returned home and sat by the window. The city lights shimmered below like a sea of stars. She thought of her mother again, how proud she would be, how she would probably say, "You're exactly where you're meant to be." She smiled softly, her eyes shining. She had started as a shy, unknown girl from a quiet town. Now she was touching hearts across the world, not with fame or grandeur, but with honesty. Her story was living proof that even the softest voice could echo the loudest if it came from the heart. As she closed her eyes that night, she whispered a quiet promise to herself. No matter how far her journey went, she would always stay the same, the girl who played for love, for truth, and for the memory of her mother's gentle voice saying, "Never let the world silence your song." And as she drifted into sleep, the faint sound of a piano played in her mind, and soft, pure, and endless, just like her dream. The months after her public performances passed quickly, but for her, each day felt full of new discoveries. The quiet girl who once feared standing on stage had learned that the world could listen, if she was brave enough to speak through her music. Every morning she woke with a mix of excitement and nervousness. She would touch the piano keys gently, feeling the familiar weight and warmth, and remember how far she had come. She had become known as the girl whose music moved people, not because it was flashy or fast, but because it carried honesty. People often asked where she had learned to play so beautifully. She would smile softly and say, "I just listened." That answer puzzled many, but it felt true to her. She didn't want to be praised for skill alone. She wanted to be recognized for heart. One afternoon, she received an invitation that made her heart beat faster. A renowned music festival in the city wanted her to perform. It was one of the biggest events she had ever been invited to, with professional musicians from around the world attending. At first, fear washed over her. She was not used to such attention, and the thought of performing in front of such an audience was overwhelming. But then she remembered all the times she had faced fear before: the competition, the conservatory recital, her first public performance by the fountain. Each time the fear had been strong, but music had always guided her. She took a deep breath, held the invitation in her hands, and whispered, "I can do this." The day of the festival arrived, and she felt the familiar nerves as she entered the grand hall. The stage was enormous, the lights bright, and the audience vast. She could hear murmurs from the crowd, some curious, some skeptical, but she focused on the piano in front of her, the same instrument she had played so many times in private, and let her hands hover over the keys. When she began to play, the first note was soft and clear. Slowly, the melody unfolded, weaving stories of hope, courage, and love. She didn't play for applause. She played for the quiet girl she had once been, for the mother who had inspired her, and for everyone in the audience who had ever felt overlooked or unheard. As she played, the hall fell completely silent. People were captivated, leaning forward, holding their breath. Even the professional musicians in attendance were surprised by the raw emotion in her music. Her fingers danced lightly over the keys, yet each note felt full and alive. She didn't rush, didn't try to impress with speed or complexity. Every sound came from her heart. When the final note faded, a moment of silence lingered, as if time itself had paused to honor what she had shared. Then slowly applause began. It grew louder, until the entire hall erupted into cheers and standing ovations. Tears glistened in many eyes, and she could feel the energy of gratitude and admiration filling the room. She stood slowly, overwhelmed by the warmth of the audience. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from the intensity of emotion she felt. She bowed deeply, feeling a connection with every person who had listened. For the first time, she realized how powerful music could be when it came from truth. After her performance, people rushed to meet her. Musicians praised her, festival organizers thanked her, and audience members shared how her music had touched their hearts. One older woman approached her, holding back tears. "Your music reminded me of my childhood," she said. "It's been years since I felt so alive. Thank you." The girl smiled softly, feeling warmth spread through her chest. She didn't know how to answer except with a simple, quiet, "Thank you." Words could not carry what her music had expressed. Later, as she walked backstage, her teacher greeted her with a proud smile. "You did it," he said simply. "You didn't just play. You told a story that everyone could understand. That is rare. That is special." She nodded, thinking of all the quiet nights she had spent alone at the piano, learning melodies, writing songs, and believing in herself when no one else had. All of those moments had led to this, to music that could touch hearts across the world. The days following the festival were full of opportunities and experiences. She performed in charity events, small concerts, and intimate gatherings. People sought her music for comfort, inspiration, and hope. Each time she played, she felt a sense of purpose growing inside her. She was no longer just a student, no longer just the quiet girl from a small town. She had become a messenger of emotion, a bridge between hearts through the power of sound. Yet she remained humble. She did not crave fame or recognition. She never wanted her music to be about her name or appearance. She focused only on the stories she could tell through the piano. Sometimes she would play for empty rooms late at night, letting the music flow without thought of who might listen. Those moments reminded her of the little girl she once was, shy, unknown, yet full of dreams. One evening, she received a letter from a foundation that had seen her performances. They wanted to support her further, providing resources to help her create an album and perform internationally. She read the letter carefully, feeling excitement mixed with nervousness. She had never imagined traveling so far, performing for strangers in distant countries. But she knew that music had no boundaries. She decided to accept the offer not for fame or money, but because she wanted her music to reach more people. She wanted those who had never felt understood to know that someone could hear their hearts without words, just through melody. Before leaving for her first international performance, she returned home to her small town for a few days. Walking through the familiar streets, visiting the places she had grown up in, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. She went to the little house where she had learned to play, ran her fingers lightly over the old piano, and whispered thank you for everything. That night, she played a piece she had written years ago, one inspired by her mother's lullaby. The notes carried memories, love, and a promise that she would continue to play no matter where life took her. Her neighbors, many of whom had watched her grow quietly, gathered outside and listened. They didn't need to say anything. The music spoke for itself. When she returned to the city, the first international performance came quickly. She stepped onto the stage in a large hall, filled with people from different countries, all expecting a great show. Her hands hovered over the keys, her heart beating fast. She remembered the first time she had played publicly, how small she had felt, how uncertain. But now she knew that feeling alone wasn't enough to stop her. She played, letting her music flow freely, full of emotion and honesty. Every note told a story, every chord carried a feeling. The audience was captivated. She could see people holding back tears, leaning forward, listening to each sound with awe. Her music had crossed borders, languages, and cultures, touching hearts in ways words never could. After the performance, the hall erupted in applause. People came to meet her, to tell her how her music had moved them, to thank her for sharing such beauty. She smiled, bowing gently, knowing that she was fulfilling the promise she had made to herself, to always play from the heart. Even as recognition grew, she never lost her humility. She continued to practice, to create, to play for those who needed it most. She remembered the shy girl who once sat by an old piano, dreaming quietly. She remembered the mother who had taught her to listen, to feel, and to trust her own voice. And she remembered the promise she had whispered long ago, to never let the world silence her song. Her story spread far and wide, inspiring other young musicians to play from their hearts rather than their heads. People who had felt overlooked, unnoticed, or shy found courage in her journey. She became a symbol of hope, a reminder that talent alone is not enough. Honesty, love, and persistence are what make music unforgettable. Through it all, she stayed the same at her core. She didn't change for applause, for fame, or for recognition. She continued to write her own music, to practice quietly in the evenings, and to play for herself when the world became too loud. And every time she played, she felt the presence of her mother, guiding her hands, reminding her that music is about connection, feeling, and truth. Years later, looking back at her journey, she realized that every step, from the shy girl in her small town to the musician on international stages, had been important. Every quiet night, every doubt, every fear had shaped her, had made her music more powerful, more honest, and more alive. And in the end, it wasn't about winning competitions, gaining recognition, or traveling the world. It was about one simple truth: that music, when played with heart, has the power to touch souls, to heal, and to connect people in ways nothing else can. The quiet girl who had once walked onto a stage trembling, unsure of herself, had become a musician whose music spoke louder than words, whose honesty reached beyond borders, and whose heart reminded the world that the truest power lies not in applause, but in sincerity. And as she sat at her piano late one night, the city lights sparkling through the window, she whispered softly to herself, "I will always play for truth. I will always play for love." The piano responded with a soft, endless melody, carrying her heart into the night, into the world, and into every listener who needed to hear it. Her journey had only just begun, but she knew one thing for certain: she would never stop playing, and she would never let the music fade.